Welcome to the Epic X-Men Reread. In this installment, we are reading the 4-issue 2008 miniseries, X-Men Worlds Apart. It was written by Christopher Yost with line art from Diogenes Neves and inks from Ed Taddeo. And you'd be forgiven if you thought this book was called Storm Worlds Apart. I mean, here she is huge on the cover, and it's really Storm who headlines this series. There's some other X-Men co-starring, but it's a focus on Storm, and it's a focus on her two worlds. So at this point, she has been married to the Black Panther and the Queen of Wakanda for about 2 years of publishing, and so she's really the co-star of the Black Panther title at this point. And at the same time, she is also a member of the X-Men, as she always has been, although she has not been quite as active in the X-Men as she's being shared across both of these franchises. So we pick up Storm's story here in the X-Men story as Cyclops is in the process of kind of rounding up various mutants and making sure they move to the West Coast with the X-Men, although they are not yet in Utopia at this point. We're still a few years before that. And Storm is assisting Cyclops in checking on the mutants, the Morlocks, who live in the sewer tunnels beneath the city of New York. But Storm is called away suddenly by Wakanda, just as Cyclops is starting to get on her case a little bit about how she really has split both her loyalties and her attentions between mutants and her subjects in Wakanda. And that's Storm's big, not decision, but her big conflict throughout all of this. She never really decides one or the other. The whole point is that Storm really feels like she can be both, but she's very torn between the two, and that would be enough fodder for a miniseries all by itself. But then we add into the mix the Shadow King. The Shadow King is primarily a psychic villain. We see him frequently doing battle with Professor Xavier, with Psylocke, but he is involved in Storm's origin, and he has always been a foe of Storm, even though Storm is not primarily a psychic character, although she's been shown to have a very indomitable will and to be very powerful on the astral plane. So Storm is called back to Wakanda from her adventure with Cyclops. I don't know if you can call wading around the sewers an adventure, because a mutant that is in Wakanda that is yet to relocate back to the X-Men's new home named Nesno has been accused of murder, and Storm is trying to get to the bottom of it because he is a pacifist. He doesn't even like to use his mutant powers, so it seems very strange that he might beat someone to death. And Storm very quickly uncovers that the reason he did that is the Shadow King. Now, the Shadow King, sometimes his motivations are a little bit oblique. What is he doing here, really? He's here to mess with Storm. Yes, he gets control of Wakanda, and yes, he gets control of the X-Men, but he could do that in a much more efficient way if he just decided not to mess with Storm. And it's kind of one of these funny things about him as a villain that Shadow King very rarely is going for world domination. He's not a Magneto who just wants to have total control. He might profess that occasionally, but if he did that, he would just start in some small nuclear-rich country that didn't have a lot of mutants and just bounce from mine to mine until he took it over and then kind of hold the world hostage. Yet he always seems to start adjacent to some mutant character who is really going to make trouble for him. So here he is starting adjacent to Storm because really his motivation is to just twist the knife and do terrible things to people and the people that they care about. So he wheedles his way into not only Nesno briefly in Wakanda, but throughout the whole Royal Guard and eventually into T'Challa. And he puts Storm in a very precarious position because Shadow King, in inhabiting all of these people, stokes the fires of anti-mutant fear in Wakanda, which is a very enclosed culture, and really, you know, at points has been a little unsure about this outsider who's a mutant being their queen, even though she is in her own way royalty. And between controlling T'Challa and the people in the palace and stoking those fires, he makes Wakanda a very dangerous place for Storm and for Nesno to be. Now, if that was the only story, that would be very interesting, but additionally, the Shadow King is also across the globe manipulating the X-Men too, and he's trying to force a choice for Storm. He's saying, you know, you've got your two worlds apart, and it's a challenge already for you to be managing them and splitting your time between them, but what if you had to choose between them in a matter of life and death? He's not trying to necessarily defeat Storm. He's saying, just choose one. You could do one of these things very well. You could just be in Wakanda and do very well. You could just be with your X-Men, but nobody should get to have it all. And I think that that actually is a really interesting commentary on Storm and on a lot of things, on marriage, on women, on probably, you know, Black women in modern culture, about having it all and the forces that are trying to make it so that you can't. Christopher Yost, as a writer, is somebody you really can rely to dig into the history of characters and get them right, get their voices right, and also give you some of this interesting thematic material, right? So did we even need the Shadow King, right? I think, as I said, I think this story would be just as interesting if it was a tug of war between these two cultures in Storm without any clear villain, but the villain gives us some conflict. So we have Storm kind of fighting a multi-front war where she has to choose how to deal with the Black Panther and also how to deal with Cyclops in two very different ways. She's not willing really to harm T'Challa ultimately. Her love for him is too great, and so she needs to kind of throw herself upon the mercy of the Panther God in order to get his intervention in the Wakanda side of the conflict. In the X-Men side, Storm has a long-running conflict with Cyclops, which partially goes back to Uncanny X-Men 201, where they had a battle for the leadership of the team, and she beats Cyclops without her powers. Of course, now she's full-powered, and she doesn't have quite the same hesitation about taking out Cyclops, if that is what it's going to take to defeat the Shadow King. In the process, we just get a lot of really interesting uses of Storm and her powers. We're reminded that she's an excellent physical combatant, that she's a thief, she can pick locks and break into things, that she's got a powerful, you know, psychic power, a powerful will, and that also she is capable of some insane feats of weather control. In one here, which is one of her craziest feats on the page ever, she basically sucks her X-Jet up into a tornado to be like zoomed across the atmosphere and plop down in California as fast as she possibly can. I remember reading it the first time just being agog at this on the page. I'm not the kind of person who's like, yeah, cool feats, you know, Thor made a lightning storm the size of a world one time, so he's gonna beat so-and-so other character. I don't really like that kind of battle board comic reading, but I will admit it's fun to watch a writer kind of stretch a mutant's power in a way that is ever so slightly scientifically supported to create something interesting on the page. Now, I personally think that Storm is a strong enough character that she really could be headlining her own series. She's one of the most visible Marvel characters, certainly one of the most visible Marvel women before Black Widow and Scarlet Witch had been in films. Storm has huge recognition, and yet this is really one of the first times she had headlined a series in a while, and it's called X-Men World Apart, not Storm World Apart, even though she's on every single cover all by herself here. And so it's not until a few years later in Marvel Now that she gets a series of her own. That one is written by Greg Pak, and it is outstanding. It's one of my top X-Men recommendations. There has been some chatter recently that we're on the way to getting a new Storm series, which is going to have artwork by Jen Bartel. The actual #1 issue has not been scheduled yet, but I'm looking forward to that. I think there's so many good stories to tell with Storm. She's a rich character, and she's a character who hasn't really been ruined or contradicted in any way that kind of makes her tiresome in the way that some other characters have, like Nightcrawler, where he's like devout and then he's not devout, and he's dead and he's not dead. Storm's a rare X-Men who's never really been dead for a length of time here. So I really enjoyed this World Apart. It was fun to go back to it. It's a very kind of popcorn munching series. It's not so serious. You know, there's not a lot of repercussions that are going to seriously last. It's not heavy reading, but it's fun reading. And I really like a good fun X-Men comic. I don't think every comic needs to be as dense as Claremont or as, you know, earth-shattering as a big event or crossover. I can appreciate smaller stories. I will say one thing I did appreciate in this that harkens back to Claremont is that Yost writes Storm's narrative voice really well throughout in a lot of caption boxes. And I think Storm's a character that benefits from caption boxes because part of the fun of Storm is seeing how she thinks about the world, and when you have a writer that's really good with her, that's one of the most delightful parts. So that is Storm Worlds Apart. I hope you enjoyed this, whether you're rereading it or whether this is a hidden gem for you. And you have to think that this is before she really ultimately has a falling out and separates from Black Panther. So this is really at the prime of Storm straddling two different worlds, which are apart. For the next issue, we are going... They are issues in a way, but they're episodes. For the next episode, we're going to read the opening arc of Exiles from 2001. We're reading that because there's a new Exiles series out from Marvel, and so we thought we would flash back to the beginning of what came before with Exiles to get ready for that new series. So I've actually never read Exiles. I'm really looking forward to giving it a try, and hopefully you will join me here on the Epic X-Men Reread. Thanks so much for watching.